Okay, welcome everyone to Let Me Tell You Why That's Bullshit, where today we're taking a break from the usual geopolitics stuff to bring you something a little bit different. Today we're going to be going a little bit more into the election of Pope Leo XIV and why this could actually be kind of important for shaping global politics. Today with me is Nick, and maybe later German might be joining us. So I guess we'll find out.
My bad. I kind of forgot to tell him about this till like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, but if he joins, then great. If not, then it's okay. We'll just continue the conversation.
Then
But
he sucks.
yeah, sorry, Jay.
Through no fault of his own.
Sorry, Jay. This is all you. But Nick, how you doing today?
I'm good. Getting over pink eye from a gas station. Don't touch your face, people.
Yep, that's why
That's
you
my
carry hand
advice for the day.
sanitizer. Carry hand sanitizer.
The pharmacist, when I went in, she was like, yeah, my 16-year-old daughter and her whole class just got pink eye from sharing phones. And like, I don't understand. Just don't touch your face. And then she
Yeah.
was like, wait, how old are you? And I was like, not 16.
Not safe. Yeah.
Just a grown-ass woman who keeps touching her face.
Yeah, but sometimes you just forget too, right? Like I was at Costco the other day and like I had to stop myself because like I was pushing the cart and then I was about to scratch and I was like, don't do that. This is
That's
fucking
just as bad as
Costco.
the gas station. The one time I forgot to sanitize.
Yeah. I mean, I remember like,
Saskatchewan's fault. It was probably the Swift Current gas station.
yeah, our last job too, I remember like the day I got COVID, you went into the office and just sprayed down my whole desk. And I was like, yeah, thanks. Good call.
At least you stayed out. The receptionist we had did not.
Yeah, I know.
And then I like called the CEO and I was like, you need to come tell her to go home.
Yeah.
Right now. And he was like, I'm not coming in that office. I think he like called her desk.
Yeah, good call. But like, yeah, wild times we lived in too, right?
See, when I got COVID, when I worked with you, I just tried to work from bed and then fell asleep halfway through one of our conversations.
See, I never even bothered to work. I'll just be like, I just wake up, send the email, be like, still sick, and then just went back to bed. And then whenever someone called me or emailed me, I would just ignore it until it was like the fourth phone call. And I was like, oh, I guess I should pick this up.
That checks out.
Yeah. But anyway, work drama aside, let's talk about the Pope. So today's a little bit different, like I said. We're going to be diving a little bit into why this is kind of important. But in order to kind of understand that, I figured it'd be good to kind of understand a little bit more theory and history behind the papacy. So, Nick, this is probably going to be a bit of like a lecture for you, but I found this stuff really interesting, and this kind of ties into what I'm studying, so I love it. It's not direct, but it's cool.
Everybody keep your eyes on Rio because I'm about to look really bored.
Yeah, just watch me. It'll be fine. So today, we'll be kind of going concepts of soft and hard power, and then we'll be discussing a little bit about why the papacy mattered historically and kind of how that builds into what the papacy is today and why it's still kind of important because the papacy has so much soft power, right? Like normally when you think of power, it's easy to think of like, nukes and missiles and aircraft carriers, but there's a certain amount of power that you get from not having those things and other things that you can use to kind of like leverage your position in the world. So introducing concepts, let's start with hard power. Like I mentioned, this is the ability of a state to exert its will over another by force. So this is typically measured in things like the number of soldiers, your types of weaponry, how effective that weaponry is, and so on. Some examples for everyone that are really easy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a clash of hard power. The war in Iraq, World War II. Basically, if it's an armed conflict, it's a clash of hard power. Or hard power is being used to force another country to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. So kind of like the war in Iraq most recently is probably the easiest one, where the United States literally just showed up, took over a bunch of oil wells and ports, then executed Saddam Hussein, and then controlled the government basically for like several years. That's hard power, right? Like really easy example there. And there's a whole conversation to be had about how and why states go to war and how hard power plays into it. But basically, that's kind of the general idea that you need for what hard power is today. Soft power, on the other hand, though, is the other ways that a state can exert its will on another state or on its people. This is usually more subtle and it doesn't affect the state or its leadership directly, but it can influence them in other ways. Some examples of this are like economics. So the United States is the world's economic powerhouse, as an example, and like them starting a trade war with the rest of the world is a great example of them flexing their soft power, right? Like you put a 25% tariff on Canada, all of a sudden Canada is having a problem. You put a 100% tariff on China, all of a sudden both of your economies are having a problem, right? So there's one. Culture is another one. Really interesting here is the Korean wave, where like since the 1990s, like Korean culture has just gotten more, prevalent in the West. And like, you see the rise of like K-pop groups like Blackpink or BTS, or like K-dramas like Squid Game, or like films like Parasite. And like, 40 years ago, you wouldn't have heard about any sort of Korean media, but like now it's regular. You will regularly hear about like, oh, this K-pop star is playing at Coachella, or like, hey, this new Korean movie just came out, or the drama's on Netflix or something like that, right?
I thought Parasite was a horror movie for till like a month ago.
Full disclosure, I still haven't watched it. Like, it's been on my list for like since it came out. I just haven't gotten around to it because I'm just like, why would I watch Parasite when I can rewatch The Good Place for the 20th time? So
I just assumed with that title it was a horror movie and skipped past it.
yeah, which
I
is
was like,
totally,
why does it keep recommending this?
which is totally fair. Wait, hold on. I have to Google this. I have to look this up now because I don't know what kind of movie it is.
It's
Parasite.
I think it's like political. If I remember correctly. Parasite the Grey, however, is a Korean science fiction horror movie.
Parasite, the 2019 South Korean dark comedy thriller.
Yes, I think that's that one, right?
Okay. Well,
although there's like several other ones at this point. Like there's an anime too, which is also like horror.
Yeah.
I accidentally clicked on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, I think it's like kind of more political.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a great example of soft power as well, then, because if it's about politics, then it can inform you about politics that you probably never thought about. Because I've definitely never thought about Korean politics until like martial law was declared earlier this year.
I think it's more political in just like wealth and power, like that
Okay.
kind of way, if I remember correctly. I'm sure
Okay.
somebody in the comments will be like, no, this is what it is.
Yeah. If you know what it is, then correct us, because I'll probably get around to watching this and totally misinterpret it if that's the case.
Anyway, continue, Ria.
Yep. Continuing our conversation on soft power, other examples include religion. So there are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world, 1.9 billion Muslims in the world. 20% of the American population is Catholic, with 75% of the American population being some sort of Christian. Like, these are really like strong examples of soft power, where like a pope, as an example, can influence the thinking of 1.4 billion people, right? Like churches usually have community groups or like social events or things like that. And, Sikh temples is another example, like offer free food to everyone, like who comes in, like usually on a daily or weekly basis. So like, if you're ever, hankering for a meal that's probably pretty decent quality, find a Sikh temple nearby and they'll probably have food for like whoever just comes in. So really interesting part of the Sikh community, right? But these things are important because they help build that community and that identity. And like Nick, as a sociologist, I'm sure you can speak to how important identity is to a lot of people, right?
Yeah, but I'll start offending people if I start talking about it in a religious context. Though I will say that this is like, you kind of see this throughout different religions. So like, for example, my friend was talking about how like she left the Mormon church, but she still has like a lot of baggage about the Mormon church.
Yeah.
And you know how they like send people to your door and stuff? Like usually it's like the young people to like try to coerce others to joining their cult. Yep. In the words of my friend. So I guess like part of it is when people like ask you to do things, they kind of have to do it. So she's done like cranky things, like gotten them to clean stuff in her house in exchange for listening to their
Yeah. To their
spiel.
spiel. Yeah.
Yeah, and then she'd be like, "Yeah, I left the church. Get out of my house."
Yeah.
One time I have this sign on my door that says no soliciting unless you have cookies. And so I've only ever had, like, it's clearly up for the Girl Guides because
Yeah.
I want mint cookies. You can take your garbage other cookies, but like come to my door with the mint ones. But one day the Mormons showed up and they showed up at the door and I was like, "Can you not read?" And then they pulled out, they're like, "We have Oreos in both regular and gluten-free." And I was like, "God damn it."
Damn it, they got me.
Yeah, and then I was like, "I'm taking these gluten-free ones because they're good and more expensive, and I'm also not listening to your thing."
Yeah.
So that was the shitty thing I did this year.
But like, it's funny you mentioned that too, because my girlfriend actually showed me a video this morning. It was this dude, and he was part of the Mormon Church, and he could speak like really fluent Tagalog because, like, I guess it's a thing where like you have a calling in it, right? And like his calling was to learn Tagalog, and he got sent to Calgary because there's such a large like Filipino population here, and like so his job was like trying to evangelize the Filipinos by speaking our language, right? So it's just one of those things where like,
Are most Filipinos Catholic?
yeah, so like literally every Filipino I know here in Canada is Catholic. In the Philippines itself, I know that there's a large Muslim population, like in the southern Philippines.
Oh, okay.
So like it's really it's a really interesting place and a really interesting conversation we could probably have there about like just how it's spread out, right? Because like basically Islam came like through India and like along the trade routes along like the Indian Ocean into
That
like
makes sense.
into Southeast Asia, right? And like you can even see how like say Hinduism or like Buddhism kind of like followed a similar path into Southeast Asia, and you can still see some influence of that in the Philippines itself too, right? Like sometimes it's in the architecture, sometimes it's just in like how the cultural practices. So really interesting conversation there too about just like again, religion can help form and like form the basis of an identity. Because actually, this is really interesting too. When I was in Cambodia, we got to talking with our tour guide, and he was a recently converted Christian, right? And his wife, on the other hand, was Buddhist. But they both kind of came to like this understanding of like, okay, we both just kind of have our own like perspectives on spirituality, and that's okay. But then that led to another conversation too, like, well, how does that affect, say, other people in Cambodia? And he said, well, Christianity is really small here because it's like a military dictatorship, more or less. And then you have a primarily like Buddhist population after several years of like conflict between Buddhists and Hindus for like, what was it, something like 700 years or something like that. It was a long time. So yeah, so like that informed their cultural practices too, right? Like their diet is a certain way, like they all kind of behave a certain way, they bow a certain way, as opposed to like, you go to Thailand where it's, again, a different story, right? Or you go to the Philippines where like, the conquistador rule led to a lot of like European mannerisms, right?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how religion shapes and informs different countries. But like when I look at religion, just because of my, I want to say background, well, my area of study, right? I end up focusing a lot more on like the political side of it.
Mm.
And so like right now, obviously with Donald Trump being in power in the US, a lot of my focus in my writing has been about how the right in the US has basically like somehow managed to co-opt the like Christian identity to a point where it's like, if you're not Christian if you don't vote Republican, right?
Yeah.
Which is hilarious because anybody that listens to Donald Trump for like 5 seconds should understand that there's no way that man believes in
Any
religion.
sort of
And even if he does, if there's a God, he is definitely going to hell.
Yeah. I share the sentiment.
Me as an atheist will have more chance of getting into heaven than that man.
Anyway, on the topic of politics now, that's a great segue because we can now talk a little bit about the history of the papacy and how it politically kind of evolved into like what it is today, right? Because I mentioned this before, And I should also preface this by saying, like, this is a very truncated history of the church that I'll be giving, and like how it has been affected by the papacy and how the papacy affected it. But I don't have enough time, and I'm not a theologian, so I can't really dive into this. Hi, German, you're joining us at a really interesting time.
Says Rio.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. It's interesting.
Yeah, interesting for me. Should I give him a minute, do you think? Oh, there he is.
Hello, everyone.
Surprise podcast.
Yeah. Hey, Jay.
How you are?
Oh, we're here. We're
Yeah.
just about to start diving into why the papacy mattered historically. But before we get into that, how are you?
Yeah, pardon me, what did you say? Sorry, I missed that part. How am I doing?
Yeah, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Studying valuations, so that's so much fun.
Fun.
I'm getting interrupted with, oh, I forgot to tell you, Rio and I are recording in 10 minutes. Do you want to join?
That's fine. It's probably better than reading about valuations. By any
Yeah.
means. I have lots of reading to do, but that's okay. I'd
You
rather
needed
I'd
a
rather sit
break.
on a yeah, I need a break. I'd rather sit on a call anyway. And plus my exam's next week. So like I can't be studying too hard anyway.
Yeah, want to take it a bit easy.
Yeah, it's just more kind of technical stuff that I need to kind of cover, right? That's all right. And just
Right.
reviewing notes and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you already passed the first exam too, right? So like,
No.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, this is the first
No.
one.
Well, I did. I wrote it the first time earlier this last year, but there's 3 exams you have to write, so 3 days of worth of exams. So it's like
Okay.
Wednesday to Friday.
Okay. Man. Well, good luck, and
Thank you.
hopefully learning a bit about the papacy's history today will help you in some way.
Yeah, definitely, and it's definitely an interesting topic to say the least. So
Yeah.
That's kind of why I was like, I'm still going to invite you, even though I forgot, because I feel like if you find out we did an episode on like that, you'll be like, dudes, what the fuck?
Yeah.
I was saying it's an interesting topic, so that's why I decided maybe I'll join for a bit anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Anyway, continuing the conversation, and like I said, this is going to be a very truncated history of the church. I figured the best place to start would kind of be with like Emperor Constantine and the Christianization of the Roman Empire. So this was around the years 306 to 337. And Emperor Constantine, also sometimes called Constantine the Great, was the first emperor to convert to Christianity. And this elevated the status of Christianity and the religion within Rome, which, like I said, led to the Christianization of the Roman Empire because Constantine granted the church the ability to own property, transfer property, and restored a whole bunch of properties to the church. So the church went from this like prosecuted, like targeted, hated thing within Rome to all of a sudden having a lot of power, influence, and money because the emperor decided, what was it? He had a vision, I think it was, that like from an angel or a saint or something like that, and told him to paint the shield on or paint the cross on his people's shields. And then they won a battle. And he was like, God is clearly real. This is the thing. We're all going to become Christians now. And that was the Christianization of Rome.
That's an interesting way to seize power.
Yeah, it's really like, when I think about it, like as a Catholic myself, and like as someone who just kind of like finds that bit of history like interesting, part of me is like, how much of it is like really him being like, yes, this religion, but how like another part of it too is like the Christian population of Rome at the time wasn't small. So like it's not a bad idea to just be like, yes, let's just coincidentally align ourselves with this like really like significant group of people within the country, and then just we use that, right? And then that led to like a whole bunch of other stuff like within the political sphere at the time, like between the Byzantine Empire and them. And then, long story short, like this eventually led to Christianity becoming the main religion of Europe, with whole wars being fought to convert people to Christianity. The Crusades, which were attempts to convert Muslim people to Christianity, and also just exterminate Muslims because some things never change within the church apparently. And colonialism, because again, why not oppress people who don't know about Jesus Christ, right? So there's a whole bunch of like, there's a lot of,
it's just an excuse to seize power.
Yeah, basically, right? Like when you look at it politically, that's what it is. And I pulled a bunch of examples courtesy of me being like kind of interested in this and like interested in the history a bit more. And like examples of like the papacy's hard power are really interesting because the papacy effectively was its own state for what was it, like something like 1200 years. It was between like the year 790 and I think 790 and 1870 is what I have in my notes. And like in 1870 is when it disbanded, and in that time frame, you had all these like territories within like Italy and France governed directly by the Pope, with militaries of their own that engaged in like various wars or like conflicts, including military to just maintain power within the region, right? And after the Papal States dissolved in 1870, basically all that was left were like two regiments for the Vatican City, and then I think it was Pope Paul VI like dissolved one of them, leaving only the Swiss Guard as the main guard and like security force within Vatican City, right? So you have this like really interesting case of like really hard power that existed within Europe, and like Nick, we kind of touched on this a little bit at some point. At another point, I don't remember which podcast it was, but like the Holy Roman Empire being a thing, right? Like it wasn't directly governed by the Pope, but the papacy still had influence within it because it was the Holy Roman Empire, right? Another example are the first, second, and third Crusades. Like I mentioned, Christianity and Islam, and just duking it out because why not? First Crusade.
Some things never change.
Yeah, something's never changed. First Crusade was called for by Pope Urban II. Second Crusade called for by Pope Eugene, both fighting against Seljuk Turks. And then the Third Crusade was called for by Pope Gregory VIII after the fall of Jerusalem by Saladin, who was not, well, kind of like related to the Turkish like regimes, but not totally, which is really interesting. I couldn't find, not that I couldn't find, more like I just didn't bother to dig into it, but long story short, he was an Islamic figure within the Middle East, right? Then laid siege to Jerusalem fell, and Pope Gregory VIII was like, absolutely not, and called for another crusade, which, as they do, led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of people for literally no reason. So, yeah, a few examples of hard power historically, and another one, and this one's more recent, is the colonial era, which is how a lot of Filipinos became Catholics to this day, right? Courtesy of colonialism, where basically 3 papal bulls, which is like legislation passed by the papacy, granted, it was the King of Portugal at the time, the authority to subjugate Saracens and pagans and other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, reduce their persons to perpetual servitude, and to convert them to you and your use and your successors, the kings of Portugal.
AKA seize power.
Yeah, literally, right?
And like, there's a theme running throughout this.
Yeah, there's a whole theme.
Power hungry people there.
Yeah, right. And it's funny you mentioned that too, because so the Pope granted the kings of Portugal all this power, right? And then that actually led to a little bit of conflict within Europe as like, well, why does Portugal get this power, but not, say, France or, the UK, or it wasn't Italy at the time, but it would have been like, other colonial powers within the region. Say Spain as another example, right? And like, it's really interesting that like at some point the papacy was like, oh crap, yeah, we can't do that. And this wasn't something that was resolved through like military conflicts. This is something that resolved basically through diplomacy, and everyone being like, well, we're just not gonna have the church money anymore, right?
Is this where like the whole idea of like kings and queens being put in by God came from?
Kind of.
Did it kind of manifest during this era, or was it much earlier than that?
It was a lot earlier. So actually, it's funny you mentioned. It's really interesting you mentioned that too. So like the idea of like the divine right of kings is something that
divine right. That's what I was trying to
yeah
put out.
Like that's something that kind of came out like probably around the era of, like, I don't know this for sure. So like someone fact check me. I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's something that would come out around like the era of Constantine, right? Because like Constantine effectively came to power as like the Christian emperor because of God, he says, right? And like you kind of have that idea come out more within like the rest of Europe, especially like France and like it wouldn't have been England at the time, but like the Saxon kingdoms, I guess is what they were. So you have that kind of idea come up more kind of in the medieval era, as opposed to like the like Renaissance, right? Because the year 1400 is kind of closer to the Renaissance than it is the medieval period. But Yeah. Anyway, the divine right of kings is something that's kind of always been around, and like,
Yeah, it was medieval.
Yeah.
Gained prominence during King James I of England, 1603 to 1625,
oh,
which I'd say that's closer to the colonial times.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Well, learn something new.
Yeah, it's interesting regardless if you think about it, and it's just interesting that, that still in some places it's still a pretty big thing, right?
Yeah.
So I know that whole Christianity thing, Catholicism is pretty interesting anyway.
Yeah.
And starting to learn a bit more about the history of these things. I like historical origins anyway, so that's my
Yeah.
thing.
I'm
Especially the
very
conclave.
interested. I'm very interested in like modern day, which I
Yeah.
think is up next. So
Yeah.
Yeah, the conclave thing is a little bit interesting. I think it's how many years old? It's like crazy amount of years, and they're still using the same system now.
Yep.
Although, side note, what's really interesting about that is like they also like when the church decides to do something, they do it better than anyone. Like, for example, no messages get in or out while they're trying to decide the whole like the new pope. Like they use like top jammers to jam cell phones around the Vatican, right?
And they used it. You can't even get any Wi-Fi. They
Nothing.
building everything. It's amazing.
They just do it so much better than like anyone in the world. They're just like, nope, nothing is getting through.
And honestly, and the fact that like they keep it secret and they pretty much kick everyone out and everyone who's not authorized. Like I've watched this whole thing. I really enjoy it. Like I got really into it this time because because I'm only studying, but it's just because I'm really interested in it. Went to the Vatican, went to the Rome and visited Italy and stuff like that. And honestly, it's the most historic thing in the world. And it's like you said, it works the best, even though like like it's old school. It's like using a fire burning with black and white smoke. Like it's so antique.
To be fair, the church had a lot of secrets and they're really good at keeping them. So it's not like I think the difference is the church learns, whereas political leaders are just stupid.
But I tell you,
this is what I think. This is my theory.
But they think they're like they select on God's purpose and God's opportunity, right? And that's the thing, right? And they believe everything they choose is based on God's will, right? Or God's vision, right? So 200 and what is it, 276 or something like that? I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
Pope, it's amazing, right? And it's still going on the same way. It's using the same methods, and like you said, the jamming equipment is absolutely insane, right? And you got to get out. No, it didn't even get out. Nobody said a word, right?
Yeah.
But it's a fun time, right? For sure, right?
Yeah. Pete Hegseth from the White House can definitely learn something about like information security from the church, you know?
I don't know. Like I was telling you earlier, I'm not religious in any way at all, but I can get behind a pope whose last tweet before he became pope was JD Vance is wrong.
And he's the first American. Right? He's the first American, which is a really big deal in the church, right? You've seen people who are looking like you nowadays, right? The younger people are starting to see people, right? And like I'm actually Catholic myself, and like it's just intriguing. It's just the most intriguing thing. I know, like I told my friends, regardless of the religion you support, whether you're Mormon or not, or Catholic or any type of religion, it's just intriguing. The history involved in that religion is just amazing, and it's still working now.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we were talking about earlier how like there's been so many podcasts this week about this, but there's a few people that have been talking about how like, well, they'll never say like the why. There's definitely a history of the cardinals choosing popes of particular backgrounds that lines up with historically with those places needing help, right? So like a lot of them will look to when the first Polish pope was picked back during World War II, right? So a lot of people are like, is this just the church being like, America, you need help? We're here to help you.
Yeah, and you'll never know what the conversations are within those places, right? And you never know like what's going on within those doors, behind the doors anyway. And I tell you, when you're in that Sistine Chapel, I'm not sure whether you had a chance to visit Vatican yet, Rio, but it's absolutely amazing Nick, and it's like the most amazing building and facility, and the roof is just something you never see anywhere else, and you just get mesmerized by it. I can understand why they have it in there, because it's just amazing. Like, you see the logistics that are involved by setting up that facility, by even doing the Pope's funeral. Like, my mom and I were talking about it, like, amazing, the event planning involved in this type of thing. You have politicians here, you have world leaders here, you have public here, you have all these cardinals. It's amazing the logistics are involved in this thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a big scale event. It's a national, international event.
Yeah.
Right?
And like, actually, last time I went to Rome in 2008, and like, so at the time I was still a teenager, and like, even back then, I remember just kind of walking through the chapel and being like, it was humbling, but it was just one of those experiences. Like, again, like I've said, I'm a Catholic myself. It was one of those experiences that was like really humbling, but also really like awe-inspiring to me as like a young Catholic person walking through this historically and like religiously important place, right? And like, I remember seeing like the big murals on like in Sistine Chapel, like on the roof and on the walls and everything, and just being like, my God, like it literally, like all of this was supposedly painted by like one dude, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, like,
Michelangelo, I think it was.
Yeah, a handful of like one or like a handful of guys at most, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like if you look at it throughout the history of it too, like you have all these statues that date back as far as the Roman Empire, like also stored within the Vatican museums, and like, they don't worship Laocoon or like Laosun and like his serpents or whatever, but it's still a really interesting story as to like why he's there. Or this is actually something I saw in Museum Secrets, and this is about 10 years ago. So like this is probably wrong. I don't know if it's true or not. But the reason why like all the statues have like fig leaves covering their genitalia is because one pope apparently just went crazy and was like, we can't have all these penises around here, and just went out with the chisel and hammer and knocked them all off, threw them in a drawer somewhere. And then someone was like, well, now we can't have all these deformed statues around here. How do we fix this? Fig leaves. It said so in the Bible, right?
Yeah, and it's amazing. Like, honestly, like, I tell you, like, even if you walk into the main facility and you see Pope's bodies all lying around, you can see right through the caskets. It's eerie to some people, but just history driven, and it's like something that you never think about. Like you worship these popes, you pray to these popes, you ask for penance, whatever. It's an amazing opportunity for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, like, I think people need to realize, like, regardless of the religion you're part of, regardless of what denomination people part of, and regardless of what people believe in, the history involved in any church, any facility, even the most radical religions, is amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think people have to understand the church has been around for like how many years, right? And hundreds and thousands of years, and yet it's still going strong, and it's still alive and well.
Yeah, and Nick and I actually we touched on this a little bit briefly too, about how like a religion can kind of shape a culture and like a practice. Because I mentioned that in Cambodia, when like I took a vacation back in February, like there's a history of conflict between Buddhism and Hinduism, right? Like the country was originally Buddhist, then the Hindu empires came and took over for a bit. So all the temples had like all the Buddhist iconography removed and Hindu iconography put in, and then the Buddhists took over again. I don't remember how exactly. And then at some point you had the Khmer Rouge, right? And like, all that stuff affected how the people are today. So like the history of a country and the history of our religion, like, a lot of times are intertwined in some way, and they are really important to kind of understand, like, no, that's how you get people thinking and believing a certain way as opposed to another, right? And we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about the Crusades of like, Christianity and Islam butting heads isn't anything new. That's something that's been happening for like 900 years at this point. And like, part of that is from a religious difference, but another part of that is also just political difference, which is like, as a modern person, I feel like we can get past it, right? With the value of perspective and like a historical perspective, we can see how like, okay, you know what? We all screwed up at some point. Maybe we can do better nowadays, right?
And you got to learn from what happened in the past. Like, none of it was great, but at the same time, none of it was bad either, right?
Yeah. And
because like that's at the time, like you have to accept that at that time that's how things were done, right? And like I said, yeah, they weren't right. Residential schools weren't great. All these other things are not great. But what are you going to do now? You kind of can't go back and say,
great. That's your description of a residential school.
Well,
Try
terrible.
Again.
Terrible. My grandma went to a residential school, but I can tell you, like, she's a devout Christian and devout Catholic. She goes to church when she was alive every single day, walked to church and everything like that.
Yeah, it
Is
was
she bitter?
horrendous what the church did.
Is she bitter? No, she's not, because she said,
That's not the point.
yeah, and so what can I do, right? That's like, honestly, at that time that happened, am I going to hold anger against anyone? She's the person that I would say would never be angry at anyone and never say bad words to anyone. She forgave, right? What else can she do? She can't do anything about it. Not to say it's horrendous, it's
make
terrible.
It any less horrendous.
I know, but at the same time, she didn't hold the anger.
No, not at the same time. Yeah. It is horrendous.
I know.
Stop. End of story.
I know it's horrendous. I'm not saying it's not, okay? Let's specify that. But at the same time, she didn't hold that anger, right? And she accepted what she had to go through, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. She forgave, right? And that's what she has to do. Otherwise, she's going to be angry all of her life. Right? It's horrendous for sure, but at the same time, the church needs to learn from it. Everyone needs to learn from these things. And we shouldn't be shoving them underneath the rug and hiding them. But unfortunately, places do.
And that was sort of what I was alluding to when I was saying that the church is really good at secrets.
Yep. And that is a great transition to our next part about the contemporary and modern papacy.
Wait, I have one thing to say before you do that.
Sure.
So it started with Pope Paul IV.
Okay.
And then from there, Pope Clement had the Vatican mass produce fig leaves for statues that still supported penises after they were like destroyed.
Yeah.
So like it's like kind of like it's hard to find information about it, but it sounds like what happened was basically they just had them removed and they were just like there, and then another pope came in and was like, okay, this just looks stupid. We need to fix it. And then later, funny enough, there's some that are like made of stone, but then another pope came in. And I clicked off the page, so I don't remember which one it was. But another one came in and was like, I prefer the look of metal fig leaves. So like half of them are metal and half of them are stone.
Oh my.
Anyway, really interesting conversation about papal governance there. But moving on to the contemporary and modern period.
I think we moved on.
Yeah. Because on the topic of like the residential school, how like terrible they were.
Yeah.
And also like, the rest of colonialism, like so my girlfriend and I started watching Maria Clara at Ibarra, which is a modern retelling of the Filipino story Noli Me Tangere, which is like the national story like written by the national hero and so on. It's about the abuses of the church. And it's kind of worth discussing how the Catholic Church is a non-state actor with global reach, with the Pope as its head of state and its main ambassador, right? So the papacy operates almost wholly through soft power these days, and in a way as a moral superpower where they kind of, the papacy especially has like the ability to like influence the thought processes of 1.4 billion people around the world.
But I think that's why people were like talking about how the nationality of the Pope is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And what they chose to do, right?
Yeah. And I when you mentioned like the first Polish Pope in World War II, Nick, I actually double checked it to make sure it wasn't like we didn't give misinformation by accident. But Pope Pius XII was the Pope during World War II in the Nazi occupation of Poland, and he was actually Italian. But the reason why he's still significant at the time is because he denounced anti-Semitism, denounced the war, denounced totalitarianism, criticized the Nazi attack on Poland and the prosecution of the church. He was very staunch on the principle of equality, which is the idea that like Catholics everywhere are supposed to offer compassion and help to anyone, regardless of their background, right? And like, so he called on Catholics to provide help to victims of the war wherever they could. And he even told Catholics at the time to provide aid to Jews in Nazi concentration camps where they could. And this was something that was praised by the chief rabbi of Rome at the time, who said, Jews will always remember what the Catholic Church did for them by order of the Pope during the Second World War. When the war was raging, Pius spoke out very often to condemn the false race theory, right? So this was someone in the middle of like a really turbulent, politically turbulent time, standing up against an authoritarian regime. And that's actually been really interesting because that's a common theme for the papacy I've noticed like since World War II, like when I was doing my research for this podcast, like a lot of the popes throughout history have spoken out in some way against like authoritarian regimes or totalitarian regimes. And Pope John Paul II, which was Pope who was Pope when I was a kid, Again, really interesting case. Or I should say Saint John Paul
Yeah,
II.
he's a saint now.
Yeah, he got beatified as a saint by Francis. And again, it's like really interesting guy, and like soft power, like issued several apologies on behalf of the church, including for its role in the Atlantic slave trade. Outspoken opponent of apartheid, in South Africa, and he was a notable critic of communist rule and dictatorships. So ostensibly, I can't verify this is true.
Oh,
but
perfect segue.
Nope, yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Go for it.
So, because I was just trying to quickly find out why people were talking about like the first Polish Pope in reference to the first American Pope, of like why the church made the decision they made and like why that was so pivotal. So apparently the first Polish Pope was Pope John Paul II, who was the first non-Italian Pope in over 400 years. And the reason it was so significant was because at the time, Poland was really, in 1979, dealing with communism. And so the standing theory is that the church, in their like soft power way, elected a Polish Pope to quash the communist uprising in Poland. Fun fact.
Interesting. See, I learned something new today. And like, go ahead, Jeremy.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, that's important to understand, right? And that's really, really important to understand, because during that time, that's what they needed at that time, and that's why he was the first non-Italian, and he's also, I think, another thing in history you should notice, he's also the third longest serving Pope in history. Too.
But I think the significance more there is just like the West had decided communism bad, quash now, right? And people are talking about this in relation to, what's the new guy's name? Pope Leo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Leo 14.
In relation to Leo, because of what's going on in America, like we're seeing a huge backslide into authoritarianism in America. And so like historically, when you look at the election of popes, there is, while the church doesn't directly talk about that, you can see historical parallels around pope picks. So people are talking about Pope Leo in relation to Pope Paul II because of that, right? Because of what's happening in America, and like drawing those parallels, which I think is super interesting. That like I think it's important to recognize that the church, like it or not, still has a lot of power. And like that election of Pope Leo as an American 100 days into Trump's regime, I'm going to call it a regime now, is quite the coincidence.
Yeah. And actually, that is a great segue into discussing more of like
this is what I said.
Yeah. Great segue.
And he was super young. Pope John Paul II was super young too.
Yes, he was also really young. Well, young for a pope, just like
58.
Pope Leo, right?
I think it was 58. I think it was 58. Pope John.
Pope Leo's what, 60?
69.
Oh, 69.
Yeah.
That's still young for a pope.
Very young for a pope, right? Like, what was it? Because Pope Francis was pope for 12, 13 years.
I think he was actually, I think, I remember the age, I think he was 79 years old when he became pope. Don't ask me how I remember these numbers.
He was pope for 12 years, and he was born in 1936. So he was just under 90 years old when he died. So, yeah. Meanwhile, Pope Leo was born in 1955.
More old white dudes controlling shit. Shocking.
Yeah, I was hoping for the Filipino one, but that's beside the point.
I was
that might be too far right now.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to see an Asian one there. The
first Asian pope, the first Filipino pope. Actually, so my girlfriend and I were talking about that, because I was like, I mean, on the one hand, it'd be really cool because it'd be like the first Filipino pope. That's a huge deal. On the other hand, though, it's like just knowing what I do of Filipinos, because I am one. Part of me is like, would I want a Filipino pope?
That's interesting, right? The fact that like they were talking about that particular person as well in a time where things are happening in the Philippines is also not a coincidence.
Yeah. And like there's a whole, actually this is something related but also kind of not, like the current Filipino president has been accused of like trying to erase and like rewrite history on like several occasions, right? So like I think the reason why Cardinal Tagle became such like a big conversation at the time of like the conclave was that like, yeah, you know what, the Philippines does need help. It's currently struggling with with an issue of identity again,
Yeah.
where like you now have the
Well, the
son.
church doesn't want to lose its power there.
Yeah, and you have the son of like a former dictator, like that's who Ferdinand Marcos was. He declared martial law. He is a dictator. Like you have the son of a former dictator running the country now, and like in a time too where like even the previous president was criticized for being like very authoritarian, right?
Mhm.
So like the election of Pope Leo the 14th is probably related in some way too, because like, you know, if you balance the two, the United States is easily like the more, you know, important quote unquote country.
Well, also we got to stop the US before it's that.
That bad, yeah.
Mhm.
I mean,
Any-
it's bad, but
yeah, it's
before there's
bad,
a point of no return and we get Don Jr. next.
You're right. Like, let's prevent the return of kings. Anyway, segue onto the soft power conversation, because the power of the papacy does include some capacity for like negotiations and brokering deals, right? And I was able to dig up 3 examples, just kind of like in a few days of research, because I just couldn't go
I
much
think
further.
Pope John Paul II is on here.
Yeah, I got him in. I got him in my notes. I thought you saw that.
No. I'm just that good at researching on the fly. It's almost like I have 3 degrees in research.
Right. Anyway, continuing conversation, and these are all more or less brokered under Francis in some way because they're the most recent. Example 1 is the CCP in China. So the church has been able to negotiate, like historical context, like the CCP of China has control over the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, and that is more or less their version of the Catholic Church, right? It's not but it's not ruled over by the Vatican, and the state appoints bishops. So huge problem to the papacy. However, the Vatican's doctrine, of course, is that bishops must be appointed by the Pope, and so the Vatican considered any CCP appointments as illicit, right? What ended up happening was in 2018 they agreed that the Chinese government could suggest bishop candidates, and the papacy could then approve like one of them to be a bishop, depending on whatever region they needed to be. And this probably doesn't seem like a very big deal to most people, and like to most people it isn't. But for context, within China, you basically had like an underground Roman Catholic Church, and then you had a state-run Roman Catholic Church, right? And this was kind of an attempt for the church to reconcile like the two of them and kind of start operating a little bit more out of the shadows in the public, right? Because this now allows like the Chinese state church to have like some sort of like sanction from the Roman Catholic Church itself, as long as whichever bishop they choose aligns more or less with Catholic teaching. And not an enormous deal for most people, but a big deal in the area, because all of a sudden now the church has a bit more influence within China, when basically you just have the Chinese government there. Another example that I was able to find was the Cuban thaw between U.S.-Cuba relations. This was something that was brokered by Francis and the Holy See under Obama and then Trump, to kind of lead to a cooling of relations between the two countries and a little bit more of a normalization. So just one of those things where like it wasn't the papacy benefiting directly, but they influenced the outcome by brokering the conversation. And third example I was able to find again really quickly was actually in Vietnam. So Vietnam doesn't have an official Vatican ambassador due to communist restrictions, but they've recently agreed to allow a papal representative in Hanoi, which is a huge shift from the past, right? Like they didn't have any sort of papal representation. The papacy didn't have any sort of representation within Vietnam, but now they have someone there to kind of act as like, at the very least, some kind of oversight, but someone there to also have a discussion with if there's ever a problem or they want to do something within Vietnam. So that's something that could, again, kind of allow the papacy to have a little bit more influence within a country that has been recently, I should say, authoritarian and under a communist regime. So tying it back to modern politics, this is kind of where Pope Leo gets to be a little bit more interesting and a little bit more involved, because he's been a strong supporter of Francis. He's expected to build on Francis's legacy of like church reform and like trying to make it more inclusive. And Nick, like you mentioned, like as the first American Pope and probably selected because America needs help, like he has the capacity and like the ability to really influence like the thought processes of millions of Americans, right? And like not just that, but 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. And as a little bit more context for who Pope Leo is, I was able to dig up a little bit on like his history as like cardinal and bishop and so on. He expressed support for COVID-19 vaccination, expressed support for Black Lives Matter protesters, and sympathy for George Floyd. He
Trump's
worked,
gonna hate this guy.
yeah, he worked to directly support Venezuelan refugees in Peru. Has criticized Trump for his meeting with El Salvador's President Bukele, and what is it, the mega prison plan now that they're going through with?
Is this Pope
Mhm.
Francis?
This is Pope Leo. Like,
This is Pope. Okay,
the
this is
current
Leo.
Pope,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah.
Let's see. Criticized Trump's 2016 administration. Recently criticized J.D. Vance. Continues to criticize Trump's 2020 administration or 2024 administration. And in 2023 has stated that there's a need for the church to be more open, welcoming, and emphasizing the need to not make people feel excluded because of the choices they make. Now,
Yeah.
I will say that this guy doesn't have. It's not that this guy doesn't have problems, but for a pope, this is all pretty progressive and something worth
Yeah.
considering.
This wasn't an accident.
Literally, right? It wasn't an accident because,
Mhm.
like, you have people like lay people like me, basically, just common peasants, dirty in the fucking streets, to like high office like JD Vance or like a significant part of France still, right? Like you have people like in all walks of life that are Catholics, and you now have an American Pope who can like in a way define the morality of the American people because he's an American, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So like, and I mentioned this earlier, German. I'm not sure if you were there for it, but there were literally parts, like there was literally footage after after the election of Pope Leo of American people in St. Peter's Square, like, waving the American flag, like chanting like USA, USA, like, super gung ho about it because, American exceptionalism, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's part of that soft power because now you have an American Pope with a people who are like really proud of who they are as Americans and like
Mhm.
proud of their identity in general,
Mhm.
that now have this other leader that they can look to.
But that wasn't an accident, right? Like
Yeah.
given how outspoken that particular person has been on the
Mhm.
Trump administration for 10 years, like that is very much the church electing somebody into a direct oppositional voice to the Trump administration.
Yeah.
And as a side note, hopefully he limits visits with JD Vance for health reasons.
Yeah. Like, yeah, we don't need another Francis happening within the next couple of weeks, let me tell you. But I thought this would kind of be a good point to kind of like open it up more to like conversation, because now we've kind of gone through the history and a little bit more like the theory of like why the papacy matters, like what it like its history and like how it became what it is today. Very short, truncated version, but something worth discussing. And like, I kind of want to get your guys' thoughts. Like, do you think that American Catholics are more likely to start aligning their thinking with Pope Leo because he's American, right? Like, we've touched on the idea of like American identity and like how identity can really shape someone's perspectives and views. So how do you think that this could start affecting that, right? Like, you have Republican Americans who basically treat Trump as king, but among that is a population of Catholics who still see religion as like their core, right? So how do you reconcile that, where all of a sudden you have to choose between like your church and your state, right?
I mean, is that new though? Republicans are pansy ass cowards. So like, I guess that depends on like the people you're talking about. Is it going to affect those in power in the government? No. People like McConnell are still just going to look out for themselves.
Yeah.
So that really depends on, is that voice going to be enough to raise Catholics in the US to say this is fucked up? I don't know, maybe, but I think the problem is that like Trump's approval rating is in the 30s now.
Yeah.
When Nixon stepped down, his approval rating was still 25%. So like there's always going to be that core base. So, and MAGA is already putting out posts online being like, this isn't a real pope, he's woke. So like I think it's already being written off, and those people that are swing voters are already in that this is not what I meant camp.
Yeah.
And so like, and you can see that, like I listen to, God help me, every week I listen to Sarah Longwell's focus group podcast where she like directly talks to American voters. And right now she's been really interested in the swing voters that were Biden and then Trump voters.
Yeah.
And some of them were Obama, who ran against Trump, Clinton, Biden, Trump is how they voted. And so like that's already kind of appearing where people are like, I don't like what he's doing and I never liked him, but like he's doing something. So I don't know. I don't know if it will be enough to shape it, but I have a very cynical view of religion. Like I have friends that are religious and they like go through the motions, right? They go to church like every week. They, you know, live good lives morally, blah, blah, blah. But then you have people that are just like, yeah, I go to church on Christmas and Easter.
Yeah.
So, which is like the majority of friends, even in Alberta, the majority of the friends that I have that are Christians don't do the whole church thing, right? So like, I don't know, modernly, is it enough to influence people? I don't know. German, you're probably way more optimistic than me, so take it from the optimistic side. Or maybe you're not. Maybe you're going to be like, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer anyway, right? I'll take it from both sides, okay? It's a tough question to answer, and it's something that I think is something that most things are grappling with right now, just generally, right? In terms of how I feel, I am optimistic, but I'm also a bit kind of worried, if that's the right word, or anxious is the right word, to whether it actually will work, right? I think we have to realize that right now, that America is at a turning point right now, and that's why they've elected Pope Leo to kind of be that in-between person. But at the same time, can he do more and help? To some extent, yes, but at the same time, not really, because I think the problem with like a lot of these things is that each individual country and each individual place is their own, run by their own government, and it is elected by their own people. People wanted Trump, so they elected him. Whether or not they really like him now is another story, right? But I think people have to realize they elected Trump. And I know people are having remorse, but you can't really do much about that part. You can't go back and say, I wish I didn't elect him. You elected him. I think
But America has checks and balances, and if the Republicans were doing what they should be doing, Trump should be impeached by now.
Yes.
But they don't, because they're cowards.
Yeah, and that's another issue altogether. And I think that's the problem with politics in general. People are not willing to stand up. Do their job. And I think it's a prime example in the States right now, right? Because the Republicans follow a certain line. Like I think I had a similar conversation, is that they believe that their vision is the right vision. They believe that they have to protect all these rights and all these things and liberty and whatever. And I get that. It's like the Conservative Party stuff in Canada, right? It's starting to come to that point, or the UCP even in Alberta. They have to protect. They feel like that if they're not in power, they have to protect certain things, or if they're in power, they have to protect certain things. And I think people have to understand that when it comes to politics, people are just kind of like really fringe. And like I told my friend, she's an ultra conservative person. She's involved in Conservative Party politics for years. And I told her what those comments that I received the other time, right? And she said those are inexcusable, those are vile, and those are racist.
Is that the one you sent me on Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I told her about it, and she was like absolutely shocked that they would have said that to me, right? And
shocked. Come on.
And I told her, like, it's too bad that the conservative politics are like that, because that's the reason why I cannot support that or cannot be part of that, right? But at the same time, I agree with certain things, like about fiscal conservative, all those natures, which we've already talked about in previous podcasts.
But that's a prime example of somebody just closing their eyes, because anybody that's paying attention, that's not new.
And she's like, she knows it's not new, and she said she's so saddened the fact that it's happening, right? And she knows it's not something that's not. It's more common than she thinks, but at the same time, like I guess she's overlooking it.
Those people don't stand up within the party to do anything.
And that's the worst part about it, is that they're not willing to stand up. And when someone stands up again, you get kicked out of the party. And that's why when people say to me, like, why don't you get in politics? Why don't you go run? I said, if I were to run, I wouldn't want to keep quiet. Like I would probably be asked to leave the party years ago.
I mean, you noticed that right after Polyev lost his seat and as leadership is up in the air, conservatives have been tripping over each other to get on CBC suddenly. That speaks volumes to how Polyev runs that party. And the second he was booted, MPs were like, cool, I can talk now.
Yeah, and I think you have to realize that hopefully Wheel can stand up to these things, but at the same time, he is one person. Like, you need multiple people running and standing up, and that comes from the checks and balances you mentioned with the U.S. government, which are not existent right now, unfortunately.
I think what the church is trying to do is almost put a global check on the U.S. Like, even if we look at the U.S., how you're talking about politics, like, I think a good way to describe this is that at this point, so one thing that conservatives do really, really well, and not just like regular conservatives, like just the right in general, is they manage to make their politics a cultural identity. And this goes back to like talking about politics as a team sport a little bit. People get so into that it just becomes part of them, right? So when you dip down, so the actual core like mega people are about 25%, right? Trump has in the low 30% range popularity right now, right? So he's getting like really, really close to dropping down into that range where it's just his core supporters. These are supporters that literally have a mega identity. Like your Christine, what's her name? Christine Nome? Christine Gnomes, your Marjorie Taylor Greene nut jobs. But like, these are like the regular people versions of them. They exist, and mega is their culture. So like from a sociological perspective, Trump has weaseled his way in, made the mega thing like a cultural phenomena. And I think with like what we've seen from that and with how ingrained people are, including just being like, fuck due process. Like, if this was the Democrats, like, could you imagine if Obama was like, I'm going to just send people to El Salvador? Those people would be losing their minds. But because Trump has managed to basically make himself a cultural king, it's not going to be easy, like you said, for a pope to just, like, swing in and be like, no, you should all be woke. Because that's the message from MAGA, right? That's not... They're just like, oh, he's not the real representative because he's woke, because, you know, he sees people as equals. And those messages have already started to come out of the Trump administration, basically 5 seconds after Trump congratulated Leo.
But I want to add quickly. I think the thing you have to people have to understand is that that if the Pope tells the U.S. what to do or how to run their affairs, that's a problem too.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think it's so much about telling, though. It's about leading by example, right?
Yeah, I think we can lead by example.
Exactly what he's doing by like opposing the anti-LGBTQ issues, by being like, DEI is not a bad thing, people. You know, by saying things like, you should probably not hate due process. Like, just by being, because he has it's the same idea as like celebrities using their voices, right? Like Taylor Swift came out as an example for Kamala Harris, using her voice to be like, guys, think about that. But that's not all that much different than what the Pope is doing. Like, Taylor Swift has a cult. These are all just like voices of opposition.
But you have to realize that when you think about Donald Trump is one of those people who is not going to take feedback, not going to listen to anyone. He's going to think he's the best way, and he's going to do it his way. So if you're talking to a rational person who actually think things through, maybe they might take that into consideration. But you're talking about Donald Trump here, and
yeah,
you're
no,
talking
he's
with
not going to do it.
he's not
Unless they
going to.
impeach him, people are going to El Salvador for the next 3.5 years.
Yeah, and so like you have to realize who we're dealing with. Like, even though Pope Leo, even though Taylor Swift, even though whoever might say certain things, is Trump going to really care?
No, but the point isn't to influence Trump. The point is to influence the Republicans who have control of both the House and the Senate right now. And like, if you actually go and do research, Trump has committed no less than 80 impeachment offenses. Like that would be like clear, this is an impeachable offense. Bribery is listed in the Constitution as an impeachable offense.
And I know where that. Yeah, and that's
like,
the thing.
It isn't about like influencing Trump. It's about influencing the people in power that can do something about Trump.
Yeah, but unfortunately,
and it's not going to work.
Unfortunately, the people there are going to represent their views, and they're going to stand by their party, even if it means going against.
So
it's not about their views, though, right? Like, and this is the thing that drives me fucking batty about the Republicans. They're all talking to reporters off the record, which means they can't name them. But like many reporters are saying the same thing. They're disgusted. They're afraid. Blah, de, blah. Fucking do something then. Just impeach his ass, put him in prison, and move on.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, they don't have balls. They don't have balls. is in other words, right?
Do your fucking job.
Yeah.
And they never will. They never will do that because that puts their jobs and their party at risk.
No,
and
they're
also,
too afraid of Elon Musk primarying them.
And also that too. That's another problem.
We'll see what happens in the midterms when they become afraid of their voters. Anyway, Rio, you were going to say something.
Sorry, Rio.
Ranting.
Yeah. No worries. On the topic of midterms, actually, that's kind of where I wanted to jump in because I was thinking like, because for me, and like I'm saying this as like a Catholic person who like does like the Pope, right? And like that's kind of where his power is, it's not in the high office people, right? Like it's not there. It's all like, and the Catholic Church has always historically been, and has actually, I should say, is supposed to have been for the people, right? Like in the sense that like it's for, you know, the lay person to kind of have some sort of connection to God, and like, you know, the priest or like, you know, the Pope or cardinal or bishop, whoever it is in like whichever church you attend, is supposed to be the person that like you go to seek counsel about your religious affairs and your spiritual affairs, right? So like I think the power is more so in how he can influence and like start to influence like you know, those individual voters. And like, yeah, Nick, you're right, like a lot of like MAGA voters are fucking crazy town banana
it's the
pants.
swing voters that you need, and the Democrats who didn't show up to show up.
Exactly, right? And like, you know, this is one of those things that I think, because Pope Leo is an American, like not even necessarily that because he's like the Pope, but just because now he's like such a like in your face American figure, like on the global stage, like who now has these meetings with like, you know,
he has a megaphone.
Yeah, exactly. He has a megaphone and a platform and like a whole square full of people that are like waiting to hear everything he says.
Kind of drives me crazy though. Like if you need your American Pope to tell you that due process is necessary and you shouldn't be like sending people to torture prisons in El Salvador, that's fucked up.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree.
Like totally as a Catholic, I know that whether or not you are Catholic or not, you're both going to be like, what the fuck, dude?
Yeah. I know. And that's one of those things where I was like, yeah, it's one of those things where I was like, okay, like we're at this point in history, huh? But that actually leads me to my next question, where like, you know, not just in the United States in general, like not just the United States, I should say, but in general, like we've seen a rise of authoritarianism and like nationalism, right? Like that's not unique to the United States. It's happening
in Turkey,
the Philippines, right?
Philippines, Russia. Yeah. Russia's been happening for a long time.
Yeah, Russia's been happening for World War II end.
Were they the first sort of like, probably not, but that like idea of a democratic election where like that leader wins, because Hungary was the same, right? Where they had like fair and free elections. He lost once, got booted, and then he was like, fuck that shit. When I get back into power, like
yeah.
And actually what's interesting too about that is that if you look at Hungary as an example. Like they've started in the last couple of elections where it's only the last like election where the world has kind of looked at them and said, okay, you're no longer a democracy.
Yeah.
But he's been in power since what, like 2010, something like that. And people were talking about how like they were technically still democratic elections, but he managed to like jerry rig so much that he just like wins, right? Whereas Russia's just like, vote for me or I'm going to poison you.
Yeah.
Democratic elections.
Yeah, in a democratic election. Right?
Yeah.
And
But like it's just interesting how like the modern authoritarian is rooted in democracy.
Yeah. And it's actually like the modern authoritarian is rooted in democracy. And like there's this really interesting, like, and we touched on this earlier with our like papal history bit of like the popes, especially like since like I'd say maybe early 20th century, like late 19th, early 20th century, have been very opposed to like authoritarianism in general, right? Like, so I think there's a conversation to kind of be had there about like, well, what is the role of like, what is Leo the 14th role now? So as someone who is an American, like a pope, who has already been a vocal critic of authoritarianism, whose predecessors, like within the last 115-ish years, have all been staunch critics of authoritarianism in one shape or another. Like, do you guys see this as kind of being one of those things that this is now his responsibility, is to just continue to stand up against authoritarianism and keep trying to push people back towards like, hey, you know what, democracy and like, classical liberal idealism probably wasn't that bad, right? Because like, that's what democracy was founded on, is the classical liberal idea of like, you have rights. And then the church at some point actually adopted that idea as well, which is a really interesting thing as well, that the church went from like, no, you are all subjects of God, to like, you have free will, so I guess I can't technically stop you from doing it, but I should guide you in how to use it, right? And that's a really interesting transition in what the church did. So what do you guys think? Like, what do you see as the church's role in, fighting against populism and nationalism and authoritarianism, if you have any thoughts? So Nick, you went first last time, so I'm going to say German, you go first this time.
Okay, well, I think the Pope has a huge role, right? I think we have to understand the Pope can only do so much at the end of the day, and I think that's one thing that I think is important to consider. Yes, the Pope can push back. Yes, the Pope can stand up. Yes, the Pope can do all these things. But ultimately, like we mentioned before, at least I did anyway, like, we're dealing with an unpredictable guy in the White House who doesn't really care, right? So he has a huge role to play in that, right? That type of thing. But is things going to change? Not really, until those Republicans in different houses and different senates and whatever actually stand up to him too. Because you can only, if the Pope's one person and the Pope's only one strong voice there, but at the same time you need to have multiple people pushing back, but at the same time Trump doesn't care. So I don't think, I'm not, in this case, not very hopeful things will change until Trump's not in power.
I mean, okay, so Trump's unpredictable though, right? Like, he doesn't like it when people don't like him, and historically Trump has backed down, even in the last 100 days. Like, him backing down slightly on the tariffs, this wasn't an accident. It's because people are losing their shit, and particularly business owners. So I think that there are people out there that can influence what Trump's going to do, but it's not a religious man. Like, it's not the Pope. Like, that is not the person that's going to influence Trump. The Pope is going to influence the people at best. But like, my thoughts on this is anybody with a platform should use their voice. But particularly people that are protected, right? So like, the Pope's an American citizen, but he's also the Pope. So it's not like Trump's going to disappear him.
Yeah. And
that's sort of the thing, right? Like, right now we're crossing a line into territory where journalists are very careful about what they're saying. Look at David Pakman as an example, somebody who has a large platform of 3 million subscribers on YouTube, but he's a naturalized citizen and not
a born citizen.
Yeah, like, he's a naturalized citizen through his mom, I think. One of his parents, anyway. He was born in Argentina and now lives in the US and was randomly contacted by not one, but like several immigration lawyers who were like, hey, you've mentioned on your podcast that you're going on an international trip. This is what we're seeing. And if you're doing that, you need to have your lawyer on speed dial. You need to inform that lawyer when you're coming back into the country and when to expect a call from you. And if they don't hear from you by X time, they need to start with border agents to find out what happened. And that was down to like, make sure you text them the border gate you're at, who you're seeing, like basically as much information as possible. That's fucked up. Like, just it wasn't even his immigration lawyer. He was contacted by multiple immigration lawyers that just like listened to his show. So like, I definitely think that somebody like the Pope, just from a moral standpoint, at the very least, has the responsibility to be like, hey, normal American people, this is fucked up. Maybe you should, like, I don't know, vote in 2026. And the problem is like, if the White House, and this is the thing, there's several reporters right now that say they've heard from Trump's inner circle that, which has been corroborated by like staffers, again, like off the record. But basically, they're going so hard at this because they assume they will lose the midterms. And so they need to get done as much as they possibly can and entrench themselves so much that if the Democrats do manage to take control in the midterms, it's going to be really, really hard to do anything about it during that period of time. Like, yes, if they get a high enough route, they can like impeach him and stuff. But even if you impeach Trump, at that point, he's instilled loyalists everywhere.
Yeah.
So basically, they're going to have to elect a Democratic president that gives no fucks and is totally fine doing exactly what Trump does and does things like turf Kash Patel, even though he has like a 9-year FBI term. Like, and that goes back to like, if we look at postmortems of what's happening in the US, people aren't sure that the Democrats are capable of it because they're still clinging to this, oh, but norms. Fuck norms. We are so beyond norms. If you get a Democratic president in there, you need to turf Kash Patel as like the first thing you do, right? So like, I think it's complicated from a business perspective, from an international policy perspective, from a politics perspective, and certainly from a sociological and cultural perspective. Like they're really incompetent, but at the same time, they have at least mastered the important parts, which is the cultural entrenchment and the idea of just putting loyalists everywhere and fear, quite frankly. So I don't know. I'm definitely in the America's fucked camp.
Jeremy, any more thoughts?
I was going to say you're optimistic, but maybe not. But I don't know. I agree a little bit with what you have to say, but I'm trying to be optimistic because that's all you can do at this point. You can't really do much about it, and you just hopefully that people come to their senses. But like you said, I don't agree. Like I agree that Pope like is not going to be the person who's going to be the one pushing for, like he's going to be the one standing up, but he's not the one going to be affecting it.
He's not the one that's going to affect Trump.
Yeah.
Trump directly. Yeah, he's got to influence like not even the people around him because they're the ones that wrote Project 2025.
Yeah, and that's
Pope's got to influence the people, right? And that's where I think roles of cultural icons can do that, right? So I go back to Taylor Swift and young people. Like that's another platform, right? Like I know it sounds crazy, but like that's the world we live in, a world of like celebrities and YouTubers in addition to institutions. Which is like crazy, right? But that's how you're going to get at people is through a combination of institutions like the church and institutions like culture.
And religion now is like dying across the world to some extent. So even if the Pope does influence the young people, he's not going to influence them the way that they've done in the past, right? And that's what people have to realize, is that the richest wife is starting to really die around the world right now. And so I think people have to understand, it's like people like Taylor Swift, who is like one of the biggest artists in the world and musicians in the world, that's going to influence the people who are in the generations, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, right? Like institutionally, the Pope can influence, like, definitely there will be people younger than this, but like generally speaking, institutions are going to impact Gen Xers and baby boomers.
Yeah.
Millennials are sort of a mix. Like there's definitely people within the millennial generation that could be influenced by institutions such as the Pope, but that's where you start to see that really mixed bag, right? And then you just get down to Gen Z, and it is like super fucking complicated. Like since we did that Gen Z podcast, German, like I've seen several other podcasts show up in my feed where people are talking about like the problem that young men are facing, right? So like it gets really complicated when you get down to Gen Z. And at the end of the day though, like people are going to do what they think is best for them. I mean, some of them, see, this is the other thing. Trump also has this like knack and canny for convincing people he's what's best for them. Like you hear all these stories about people who are married to immigrants that are now deported.
Yeah.
Like you literally voted for a man who wanted to deport immigrants when you're married to an immigrant, and then you're like, oh my God, I can't believe he deported my wife or my husband.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Why is
I'm
the
really
leopard eating
caught.
my face, right?
Yeah, I'm really caught between like
Nothing
influence
surprises
and
me
culture
anymore.
should work, but also people are dumb as fuck, and Trump has made himself that culture.
Yeah, but honestly, nothing surprises me anymore. Like
It doesn't surprise me. It's just depressing as fuck.
It's depressing, yes,
And-
for sure.
And enraging. Like you literally voted for a guy that was like, I'm going to do the biggest deportations in history. And then you're like, yeah, but I didn't think it would apply to my wife.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the thing, and I think people have to really be shook into the core till they realize it actually
They
affects
need
them.
to use their fucking brains.
That's another
Sorry, I'm
part
like,
too.
I've passed into it. Like I'm in pure anger territory.
And you know, like,
Yeah.
I totally get you. You have every right to be, and like, I totally get it. But at the same time, I'm trying to be optimistic because that's all you can do.
Hey, there
like,
needs to be a balance to me.
mhm.
Oh,
And it takes both of you.
yeah.
Well, I'm trying to be optimistic, as you can see, but at the same
Well,
time, I'm
sociologists
worried.
aren't optimistic. We have a whole like sociological study of religion, and it ain't optimistic.
That's why you hear business people when they're optimistic and they believe they can still rule the world even though they can't. So
But like, and that's part of the problem, right? Like, you have all of these billionaires that like put their cards behind Trump, and now they're like, wait, what? You want us? You're doing what with our tariffs? Like, look at Apple.
Yeah.
Which, total side note, what's really funny about all this tariff stuff, like all he's gonna do is he's not getting manufacturing back to America. They're just gonna transfer manufacturing from China to India. And then he's gonna have to start all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like that's what's interesting about the business community, right? They were so focused on like, oh, we're gonna get a massive tax cut.
That they
That,
forgot
like,
about
they
the
didn't
other
think to
parts of the
themselves-
economic system.
Yeah,
right?
and they didn't think to themselves like Trump loves tariffs. They just fell into this trap of, well, Trump's not gonna be like that crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy is here, people.
Yeah, but the thing about, remember, all business people
They
are
were
very
dumb
similar.
too.
All business people are very similar. I have to tell you that. Like they all have the same mindset. They all have the same type of thing.
They need
The
to
egos
change
they
it.
have, like every business person has an ego. Every business person has that narcissistic personality. Like not to say all of them are like that, but they do have a
Well,
personality.
maybe they're learning a lesson right now,
Yeah,
And,
and
and it's in their wallets.
I'm
Yeah.
sure they will. I'm sure they will. Right? I'm sure they will.
yeah,
Too bad
I mean,
there's 3.5 years left.
yeah, what was it? Like Tesla stock is down like 60%. And like
Yeah, isn't it amazing?
Elon Musk, because what was it?
In a time where electric vehicles are skyrocketing in Europe.
Yeah, and what was it? They've reported a 75% drop in revenue over the last like 2 quarters or
They
something like
think
that.
he's gonna basically rebrand as an AI company at this point.
Yeah.
It's sort
right.
of the running theory.
Yeah,
which-
and it's interesting times to say the least. And like I said, all business people think very similar. I've known that. for
Even
years.
Elon Musk being so that's another like crazy ass thing, right?
Mhm.
Elon Musk, a guy that owns a fucking car company, was like, you know what sounds like a good idea? The guy that wants to tariff all the shit.
Well, he wants also he
How did
wants to
these
be.
people become billionaires? Because they're not that smart.
well, for starters, Elon Musk was given a fucking emerald mine in South Africa, so he was already a millionaire to start.
That's
So
the
that's
problem with all these millionaires.
Yeah, so there's an easy answer to
Bezos
that
wasn't
one.
though, right? Like he didn't inherit it. He just started Amazon and got
Yeah.
lucky, right?
Yeah.
Like
But you
he
also have
was
to
in a
realize
boat.
they knew exactly what they do. They have vision, and I think that's a big thing business people have. They have vision of things like
They
this,
need to
right?
get smart.
Yeah.
It's a new
And
world, people.
but and I think business people like they all have certain personalities too. So that's why they're all like that. Like that's why we're not working. Well, at least Rio and I are both not working like starting our own business right now, right? Or at least not in that big stage.
Not in
of
the
business, right?
traditional sense. Yeah.
So like you can say like that's why we're both working for people, right? Is because we're not that type of personality and we're not aggressive and we're not able to sell ice to an Eskimo, right? Like if you could sell ice to an Eskimo, we would be no problem
Yeah.
in business, right?
How the fuck did a guy that bankrupted a casino manage to
casinos.
sell people 4 casinos, manage to sell people on vote for me as president because business?
Well, like look at
Getting a
him.
headache,
That's the reason why he's able to do it is because he's able to convince people. He's able to outsmart people, and he's able to earn money.
Smart.
Like
Let's use that like lightly.
I know like it's not like that smartness in some ways, but at the same time he knows how to.
You know what it is? It goes back to what I was talking about though. Like Trump was a celebrity. Fuck, even Reagan was a celebrity before, like he was an actor before he took office.
Mhm.
So like that goes back to that influence in culture, right? Oh, let's vote for the guy that fired people on a reality TV show that has writers as president because he's a brilliant businessman.
Yeah,
But
but he's
and
good
that's-
at branding. He's good at
That's a
branding too.
celebrity influence on America.
Yep.
Again, going back to Reagan, right?
Mhm.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, California, right? Like,
Yeah.
He's a good branding person too. Like he knows how to brand himself. That's
well, he
another
knows
thing.
who to hire.
Yeah.
Well, that's with every business person. If they know how to hire the right person, they know how to build that business. And like I said, Trump is like convincing, and he knows how to sell. He's charming.
People do say that he's I look at it and I'm like, my husband and I were having this conversation and I was like, I don't get how somebody can like watch that man on TV and be like, yeah, that's the epitome of confidence. But apparently in private, like he's really charismatic and doesn't seem crazy.
And supposedly he's very charming. He's very
Yeah,
talented.
and I don't.
That's a totally another issue because I
don't
was
get
talking
it.
to my
I
friend.
would
My friend had
love
one
for somebody
situation
to
like
like
that.
video
right?
it because I would love to see these as a just from a pure sociological perspective. I would love to see these two Trumps.
I'd love
You
to
know
see the
what?
juxtaposition of the two.
Yeah.
For sure.
Like it'd be really interesting to see.
And I
like,
think it's interesting to know, and we should have another podcast maybe one time on like the psychology of people just in general and sociology of people because I think you would offer a lot of insight into it, Nick. And because like honestly, like people get charmed by these people and they're promised a cow and sky and moon and whatever universe, but yet they fall for it both romantically and in business.
yeah,
So
as
I
long-
think you'd offer a lot of insights in that because of your background. And I had a conversation last night with someone about that. So it's like she was really charmed by one of the guys and was going to pay her $10,000, like working part time, like, and she fell for it, right?
Well,
So I
and
think-
that's the thing with dictators, right?
Mhm.
Is they all have that in common. They're very charming. People love Bukele in El Salvador. He is a super popular president.
Mhm.
people love
Good
Duterte,
news, though,
people
German.
love
We have
Marcos. Like
Pardon me?
Good news, I said good news though, German. We have to film like 3 podcasts over the next 3 months that's just themed. So
Awesome.
maybe that'll come.
Yeah, and
anyway,
it's like your expertise too.
anyway, just kind of bringing
Bring
it
it
back
back.
and
Yeah.
wrapping it up a bit because that was the end of my conversation that I wanted to have.
I went on a bit of a rant there.
Yeah, they went on a really solid rant, and like I respect it. Like,
I know you respect the solid rant.
yeah, so like I think that's something that we can probably have a conversation about too later, right? Is like the idea of celebrity worship, and especially in the United States, where like it's so prevalent, and like, you know, it's not even just Donald Trump. Like we were talking about Taylor Swift earlier. Like there are literally like 9 different Taylor Swift subreddits, as an example. Like,
Jesus.
yeah, and like there's the main one, which is like, you know, people actually talking about her music, but then there are like the creepy ones where it's like armpits, legs, pictures, you know, stuff like that, where it's like, you know, there's a certain amount of like, okay,
Yeah,
where
that
are
doesn't
we-
surprise me as a woman.
Yeah, I know it shouldn't, but like it's one of those things where it's like, okay, we gotta talk about how this is like bordering on worship, right? Like this is creepy. And there's something to be said there about, you know, how that celebrity worship plays into like the political process and like, you know, social processes in general, right? Like I remember like I took this as an undergrad, so everyone take this with a grain of salt. This was like fucking 10 years ago at this point.
Oh my God, you were an undergrad only 10 years ago?
I know. And then I
So
was in a social psychology course, and then we got into the conversation of like, you know, how people get affected by certain personalities, right? And Nick, you were talking about how like dictators tend to have like a really like have a certain personality and like certain personality traits about them that like lure people in and like make them agree with them.
Look at MBS.
Yeah.
It's
like,
crazy. Like if you look at what happened in the Middle East next week, and we won't get in, or last week, we won't get into the weeds of it. But like if you watch what happened with MBS and like how he welcomed Trump,
yeah,
versus like what Trump said about MBS on stage, like both of those guys were playing each other.
Yep.
And it's like absolutely fascinating to me how like MBS was able to identify this is a person that only cares about what people his age think and wants to be flattered. So we're going to give him like a horse escort to the palace, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, and Trump was like, okay, I need to make sure I'm flattering this person in a more like traditional masculine way.
Yeah.
And so he basically gave him a metaphorical blowjob on stage during his speech.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And there's something to be like, there's definitely something we can talk about there of like, you know, how these personalities even like interact too, right? Because like, you know, there's a reason why Hitler and Stalin cooperated for a little bit, right? There's a reason why they cooperated with Mussolini and, you know, the Japanese Empire at the time.
Get along.
Yeah, and like there's a reason why Vladimir Putin and Trump seem to get along really freaking well, aside from him being a Russian asset.
And I mean, Putin does know how to manipulate that, right? Like
exactly.
Russia was played a big role in the election of Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
Twice, both times.
So like there's a lot of stuff that we can kind of talk about there, and like, you know, maybe we do that for a theme episode. Like, hey, let's talk about dictators being friends, right? Because like that's what they always are. Dictators love other dictators. But anyway, let's wrap it up there because that was a really solid conversation. And long story short, for everyone who somehow made it to the end, the papacy does have some semblance of importance in the modern day, and let's see how it plays out with Pope Leo, right? So
I mean, it's definitely influential.
Yeah. Do either of you have any closing remarks or anything you want to share before we call it?
No, just hopeful, but optimistic and scared and worried.
Yeah, same.
My message is grow up hair, Republicans.
Yeah, totally fair.
And I think that's the best note on.
Yeah. Yeah, grow up hair and like, you know what? Maybe let's start having a conversation about impeaching Trump again. Like,
even the Wall Street Journal, I can't remember if you were there for that conversation, Rio, but even the Wall Street fucking Journal wrote a piece about why Trump should be impeached, which, by the way, wasn't about the cancellation of due process or sending people to a torture prison. It was, you're impacting my money.
Yep. So, yeah.
Well,
anyway, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for tuning in to Let Me Tell You Why That's Bullshit, where if it sounds like bullshit, it probably is. Thank you for listening.
Bye, guys.
Bye.